Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first virtual Communitech Data Hub session. My name is Vladimir, and I am part of the Communitech team. Before we get started today, please consider the following. You may need to close and reopen Zoom for permission changes, such as access to the camera and microphone to take effect. If you're using Zoom directly through your browser, please note that you may not be able to access all the features that the platform offers. And if you have a second monitor, we highly recommend that you use that second monitor during the session there today. And be ready to have your video on to make it a bit more interactive, but please, we'd ask that you keep your sound on mute. And finally, there's going to be a Q&A session, some time allocated for that after the session. During the session, please ask all your questions in the chat feature of the application, and I'll relay those questions to Chris, who's presenting today, so that we can address those questions after the presentation. All right. And before we begin, I'd like to thank our frontline workers who are working diligently to keep our communities safe and healthy. And thank you as well for practicing social distancing and for joining us virtually today. And I would also like to thank our sponsors for this event. This Data Hub session is made possible thanks to a number of sponsors. There's the AVEN, which is the Autonomous Vehicle Innovation Network, the NGNP platform, which is the Next Generation Networking Program, and Encore, which is the evolution of network services through a corridor in Quebec, Ontario for research and innovation. And with no further ado, I'd like to introduce Chris Willsher, who will be presenting today. Chris is the Director of Data Platforms at Communitech. He's also a data growth coach working with companies around data licensing, partnerships, and data strategy. Everyone, please join me in welcoming Chris. Chris, over to you now.
Thanks, Vlad. Give me 1 second. I'm going to share my screen here. Are you able to see that? Okay.
Yes.
Thanks, Vlad. So thank you, everybody, for joining us today. What I wanted to do over the course of the next sort of 45 minutes or so is tell you a little bit about sort of the journey that we've been on over the last 9 months in terms of understanding how companies innovate with data and working towards developing a tool, the Data Innovation Canvas, which we'll talk about today, as a mechanism for organizations to begin to think about how to better leverage the data that they have available and utilize that in their organization. So I'll talk a little bit about what data innovation is and share some examples of companies and how they're using data to provide some insights and ideas in terms of the different ways that data can be leveraged within an organization. I'll talk to some of the challenges that we found through a survey that we had done to share some of those insights and give you some ideas in terms of where some of the challenges are within organizations. And then finally, we'll introduce the Data Innovation Canvas and sort of show you this new tool that we've developed and that we're launching today. So as Vlad had indicated, I'm a director of data platforms with Communitech. I've been with the organization a little over 2 years. I originally had started off as a data growth coach and still am a growth coach today, helping a lot of our companies around strategy and partnerships and licensing, and also from a privacy by design perspective. Prior to being a member of the Communitech family, I was actually with the Weather Network, and I was director of distribution there for 12 years. And my role there was largely focused on developing partnerships with companies and helping them to leverage weather information as part of their operations. So it's providing weather to these external companies and using that as a mechanism from the Weather Network's perspective to add value to all of the data that we were generating. So I want to start by kind of polling the audience, and we're going to test something out here. So I'm hoping everything will work fine. I'm going to share a different screen with you in a second. And what I want to do is I want to gather some insights from the audience in terms of what data actually means to you. So if you have a browser window open, or if you have your phone handy that you can open a browser on your phone, I'd like you all to go to menti.com, and you should see it at the top of the screen. And Vlad, just let me know if that's not actually showing up on the screen. And then you'll be asked to enter a code, which you'll see there. So what I want you to do is go to that, and you'll have an opportunity to put in sort of 3 words or phrases about what data means to you. So what we'll do is we'll actually start creating a bit of a word cloud from polling the audience and start to get an understanding of what everybody thinks data actually is. So go ahead and start entering that into menti.com. And I'll give you a minute or so just to start putting in some things. So we're seeing a lot of different ideas and things pop up onto the screen now. And one thing that I think we can really take away is data means a lot of different things. It is an asset that a lot of businesses need to consider and understand how to leverage within their organization. But we're also seeing a number of different aspects of that. I've seen risk pop up in here. And from a privacy perspective and a regulations perspective, we're seeing increasing amount of risk that organizations need to consider in terms of leveraging the data that they have available, and being cognizant of the fact that there are potential risks for that organization that they need to understand and take account of as they're looking to leverage data. And I'm also seeing a lot of things that sort of lean towards the analytics side. And one of the phrases I heard that I actually really like is, from an analytics perspective, it's really a conversation with your market. And it's interesting to think of it in that way, because analytics really is a mechanism to be able to draw insight from how your consumers are using your product. And it's really a direct and sometimes very real-time way to understand how they're using it, where they might be getting stuck with your product. So lots of different potential ways in terms of what data means to an organization, and how companies can potentially leverage that as part of their overall business. So I'm just going to flip back to the presentation. So give me 1 second momentarily. Okay, we should be back to the presentation now. So what is data innovation? From my perspective, it's really sort of the process of taking a data set or multiple data sets, applying some sort of processing or analysis to that data, and then generating some sort of an actionable outcome that creates some sort of business value for the organization. And that last piece is really important. You really need to think about what's the business value that you're driving forward as part of your data innovation efforts. And data innovation can be important, allowing you to bring a more data-focused approach to your innovation thinking within your company. It can derive new insights and solutions for your organization, and identify new potential opportunities or new markets for the company to take advantage of. The one thing I will note, though, a lot of you have probably heard the phrase data-driven insights or data-driven organization. The one thing that I like to refer to that as more is data influenced organizations or data influenced decision making, because I still feel that there is an aspect in a lot of decisions that experience or gut instinct still plays a role within that. And I think data is a hugely valuable tool that can help you in terms of improving those decisions. But I still think that you need to consider that gut instinct and that experience as part of all your decision making as well. So when we think of organizations from a data innovation standpoint and the ones that really stand out, these are often the names that really come to the forefront in terms of companies that are really leveraging data effectively. And certainly, from an Amazon perspective, they use data in multiple ways, from a product recommendation standpoint through to optimizing their supply chain. Google uses a ton of data and collects a ton of data as well, and Netflix uses and collects thousands of different parameters that they use to improve the quality of the platform for their user experience. But it also informs a lot of the Netflix original programming that they develop. But that being said, there's a lot of other organizations that don't get quite the same play that a lot of these companies do. So one example is Coca-Cola. And many of you may have seen these machines. These are Coca-Cola's freestyle machine that they developed probably close to 10 years ago. And if you haven't seen these, you may have seen Pepsi's versions of them. But essentially, they're soft drink dispensing machines that have a touch screen in them. And what it allows users to do is to go and through the touch screen, select the drink that they want. They pretty much have the full suite of Coca-Cola products available in it, from soft drinks through to the fruit juices. And then there's also a bunch of flavoring that users can choose. So they can kind of customize the drink that they want. Coca-Cola has about 50,000 of these units across the US that are pouring 14 million drinks a day. And they began to realize that there was a lot of data that's being generated out of this. And they started using it as a market research tool to understand what consumers were actually pouring. And in 2018, it actually led to the introduction of Cherry Sprite. And it was all based off of the data that they were generating out of these machines to understand, and see that a lot of consumers were adding cherry flavoring into their Sprite soft drinks. So they had sort of some validated learning around what consumers were looking for, and they knew that if they put this product out into the market, that there was a demand for it. So it allowed them to really use data as a mechanism to really sort of drive that product forward and ensure that there would be some level of success. So what are the ways that organizations can potentially leverage data? These are sort of 5 potential aspects or different aspects in terms of how companies can think about using data. And across a number of these, they can be used in multiple different parts of the organization. So one thing with data innovation and data-focused companies in general is, it isn't necessarily just regulated to research and development or product development. This is something that can cut across the entire organization through to HR and finance and operations. And a lot of these, across these 5 buckets, there is certainly some overlap. So they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. Certain aspects of data innovation may cut across a couple of different ones. So it's not to say that any particular element would fall just in one particular bucket. So I'll quickly kind of go through these and give you some examples of how organizations are using data within each of these aspects. So if we think about it from an informing decision-making point of view, it's really about bringing that data-influenced decision-making into an organization and looking at how you can leverage data to help improve the quality of the decisions that are being made across the entire organization. So it's looking at what questions do we currently ask ourselves, and how could we potentially leverage data to help us in terms of improving the quality of the decisions that we're actually making. And a big part of this is really about improving the literacy around data within the company. And that's certainly one of the challenges that a lot of organizations face, is getting people to understand what data means and how to potentially use it. So if we look at JetBlue as an example, one of the things that they wanted to understand is around the hiring practices for their customer service agents. what can we do to improve the quality of the customer service, and how do we hire the right people to come in and do the job? And as part of that, they started looking at a lot of the customer data that they were collecting. And one of the things that they found is that customers actually, in terms of the attributes of a customer service person, they were actually ranking people that were helpful above people that were friendly. So that started to influence JetBlue from their hiring practices for their customer service agents, of looking at people that were able to think on their feet, that were able to solve people's problems quickly and sort of take action, and ensure that they were providing that real helpful service. So it sort of shifted a little bit in terms of the decisions that they were making around their hiring. If we look at the understanding the customer segment, this is really about increasing the insights, understanding how best to service the customers. And this can really open up also new products or services and opportunities by understanding these customer needs and finding a way to deliver value to them that will help them in terms of addressing these particular needs. It can also help from a marketing perspective in terms of delivering the right message at the right time, either from a customer acquisition standpoint or a customer retention standpoint. So there's actually a great video on YouTube of Scott Cook, who's one of the co-founders of Intuit. And he was talking to a Stanford business class, and he was recounting a story from the early days of Intuit when they first launched their home accounting software package. And at the time, they were sending out these surveys to try and understand who their customers were. And it was a lot of the basic demographic information that they were looking for. But one of the questions that they were asking is, where do you use the software? And the first time they sent out the survey, half the respondents came back and said they use it in an office. And they kind of thought that was odd, given that they had created a home accounting software, but they kind of chalked it up that it was the mid-'80s at the time. Maybe not everybody has computers at home. So maybe they're just taking their bills into the office and they're doing it all there. So they continued to send out these surveys over the next few years, and it continuously came back to say that 50% of them were actually using this software in an office. And he kind of jokingly says in the video, he's like, I keep wondering why people are answering this question wrong. And so they actually started to dig into this a little bit further and start to understand what customers were doing. And what they found is that the people that were using it in the office were actually a lot of small businesses that didn't have capability within their organization, that had a strong accounting background, as an example, and couldn't necessarily use the full-fledged accounting packages that were out there at the time because they didn't have the knowledge base to be able to understand it. Whereas the Intuit product was just like using a checkbook, and that they completely understood. So they were actually using this home accounting software package to manage the books of these small businesses. And that really opened up a new avenue for them to start exploring, and it made them recognize that there was a niche in the market that needed to be filled. So it allowed them to make some adaptations to their product to be able to fill that market. Improving customer value, and this one is really about finding ways that you can further engage your customers and really drive forward that value proposition for them, so that you're delivering smarter products and services to them, and really, again, kind of coming out of that understanding their needs, really delivering on the value that they're looking for. So Airbus is a great example of this. They were kind of in a unique position where they're in the middle of the supply chain, where on one side they had their suppliers that were manufacturers of the individual parts that would go to building the jets, and then on the other side they had their customers that were the airlines that were actually flying these jets as part of their operation. And these jets are creating huge volumes of data on every flight. So Airbus saw an opportunity here to be able to start aggregating a lot of this information and utilizing it in ways that they could start providing value back to their customers. So they created a platform called Skywise, where they began to pull a lot of this information in. They began to analyze it across all of these airlines. And what they did is they were able to start going to the airlines and letting them know proactively when certain parts of the plane were potentially going to fail. And what it did is allowed the airlines to take these jets out of service, be able to repair them, as opposed to having it sit on a runway full of passengers and realizing that there's an issue and they can't actually take off, which then starts costing these airlines thousands of dollars. So this was really a way that that Airbus was able to add this additional value and create a new service that airlines could buy into. Automating processes is another aspect in terms of leveraging data. And it's really about improving the efficiency of the systems and processes within an organization. It could be replacing things that are being done manually with more automated mechanisms, or it could be creating brand new automated processes that maybe aren't possible to do currently with sort of humans, and being able to do that with the computing power that we now have available to us. And in a lot of cases, this automation is really about finding and reducing operational costs within a company. So UPS is a great example of this. They've spent a number of years looking at how they can optimize fleet deployment to ensure there's increased efficiency in the delivery of parcels. So they've actually gone through a number of iterations, and their current iteration is called UPS Nav. And what this does is it takes, it understands what parcels are on the truck that need to be delivered for that particular day, and the addresses that need to go to. It takes into account other external information like traffic and weather, and it starts to optimize a route for the driver to allow them to more efficiently deliver these packages and parcels over the course of a day. And it's been hugely effective for UPS. The estimates are that it saves them upwards of $75 million a year in operational costs by optimizing these routes. So there's some tremendous value that they've been able to derive by developing this system. And then lastly is the monetization piece. And this is really about just creating and driving value and money from the data that you're actually generating. It could be to diversify your current revenue sources, or drive some additional value or revenue for your company. And this was one of the things that I did during my time at the Weather Network, was really looking at how do we provide weather data externally and create value off of that. But the example I'm going to talk about here is John Deere. And here's a company that's been around for well over 100 years. They're a leader in terms of manufacturing farm equipment. But a number of years ago, they recognized that they needed to start taking a digital transformation in their business. And they recognized a potential opportunity around intelligent farming systems. So they started investing in initially around developing soil sensors that farmers could put into their fields, and it would start generating data about the conditions of the soil. And then they would start layering on other pieces of information like weather to begin to understand what a farmer should do in that particular part of the field. So it would understand the soil conditions and then let them know, when they should fertilize the crops and what type of fertilizer they might use. And then, predicting what the potential crop output would be. So it was adding a lot of layers of data that would then go back to farmers and allow them to more efficiently run their operations. And today, the selling of data to farmers through these digital products that John Deere is now implementing is about $1 billion of their business. So it's become a significant revenue source for them, and they're no longer just manufacturers of equipment, but they're now the delivery of intelligence to farmers as well to help them and improve their processes for managing their operations. And it's really imperative for companies to start thinking about how they can leverage data across their organization. There's a number of stats that sort of support that idea, and this is certainly one of them in terms of companies that lead with data are 3 times more likely to be financially successful. And this came out of a report from the Economist Intelligence Unit. In addition to that, there was a McKinsey report that indicated that, again, companies that are leaders with data are 23 times more likely to acquire new customers and 6 times more likely to retain existing customers. So again, there's more support in the fact that those companies that are leading with data can outperform their competitors who maybe are lagging behind as it relates to leveraging data. And many of you have probably heard the phrase that data is the new oil. And as Kevin from our team always likes to say, it's also the new asbestos. There's a lot of challenges around leveraging data. And most notably is the fact that a lot of companies have not thought through the governance aspect of data. From the survey that we did last June as part of our Corporate Innovation Summit, we found that 50% of the respondents that were part of that indicated they haven't actually gone to that process of really establishing a robust data governance structure. So they're not thinking holistically around the regulatory aspects or the ethical aspects in terms of using data and ensuring that their systems and processes are in place to help them in terms of really addressing those issues. And we're certainly seeing from the news headlines all sorts of issues around how companies have leveraged data and the trouble that they've sort of gotten themselves in, from the Sidewalk Labs Waterfront Toronto project and all the potential issues and concern around how data was going to be used coming out of that project. The multitude of issues that Facebook has faced in terms of how they've used data. Data breaches seem to be almost a daily occurrence these days. And then even companies like the Weather Channel in the US, which is a company that you wouldn't necessarily think of as being one that would be wrapped up in sort of misuse of data. There's even been accusations of them in terms of deceptively collecting location data. So this is increasingly becoming a concern for consumers as they become more aware of what personal data means and the value of it and how that's being used by organizations. It's really important for companies to start thinking about this, because I think it's only going to become more important. And I think this stat just helps to emphasize that as well, that consumers are becoming more likely to sever ties with companies that may use data unethically. And it's not to say that we need to sort of lock all of the data down and not do anything with it. It's really about how do we innovate with data, but also ensure that we're doing so in an ethical manner, and we're doing so in a way that our consumers, it's transparent with our consumers that'll be using this product or service, and is in a way that they're going to be able to live with as well. So a few additional stats that came out of the workshop that we had done. We found that a number of organizations are not really starting their data projects with a clear idea of what the problem is. They may have sort of a rough idea or sometimes less than that. And this is really important, because without establishing what that problem is, it's difficult to identify what that, identifying what that business value is going to be at the end of the project. And as we talked about from the definition of data innovation, creating that business value is really an important component of it. In addition, without starting with the problem, organizations can sometimes get caught up in developing the solutions and then looking for a problem for that solution. We hear from a number of organizations around artificial intelligence and machine learning, and that they feel that they need to be doing something in that space. However, they may not necessarily be at the starting gate of even being able to do the basics around analytics. So for them to try and jump into these very advanced predictive aspects of data use can be sometimes very challenging if they haven't thought through that foundation and ensured that they've kind of got that base to build on that will allow them to be more successful in terms of leveraging a lot of these advanced technologies. We also found that there was a fairly large segment of organizations that didn't really have senior management buy-in for a lot of the data innovation projects. And this can really impede that ability to move some of these projects forward. Without that senior management engagement, the data projects may not be prioritized in the same way that some other projects are. Maybe they don't see the value in actually putting that forward. And then as well, it's also a little bit of that data literacy aspect. So one of the things that we've often heard is a lot of companies just don't know where to start. And I think that may be part of the problem as well, is it can be a little daunting in terms of trying to undertake this and not knowing what are the aspects that we need to consider and how do we need to think through these data innovation efforts to ensure that we're really pushing forward. And one of the things that companies can consider is, starting with a smaller project. Not necessarily feeling the need to invest millions of dollars of building a data lake, or you taking on sort of that machine learning or artificial intelligence project, but finding some small wins that allow you to gain some learning initially, that you can then start to build on and build your confidence around the fact that data can really have a change in terms of the organization. And for anyone that's been in the data space for any length of time, I'm sure everybody will recognize that data quality is certainly an issue. And this certainly came through in the workshop survey that we did as well. It really is something that organizations need to consider, and it's definitely not an easy fix. But again, I think from improving the literacy and ensuring that you've empowered employees to begin to think about how data can be used, and then also empowering them to raise their hand when they identify where some quality issues may reside, that these are sort of important things to start putting in place to begin to make some headway in terms of improving this data quality issue. And it's certainly within an organization, but also in terms of the data that they're bringing in from outside as well, and how that can potentially impact. At the Weather Network, when I was there, we had a client that wanted to develop a product or develop a solution that would take accumulation of snowfall at a particular area. And so we had to use Environment Canada reporting stations in order to do that, but all the reporting stations that were sort of in the immediate vicinity had some holes in it in terms of that particular data piece, where maybe it was reported 1 hour, but it was not reported in another hour. So we had to make the trade-off of going to a station that was a little further out and not necessarily ideal from a geographic location, but had that more reliable data so that we were able to actually properly get some level of accumulation. So that, again, these are the types of things that organizations need to consider and think through, and ensure that the information that's going into their systems and the analysis is also going to ensure that the things coming out of that analysis are going to be of quality as well and helpful to the organization. And then the last one is really around the measurement of success. And this can kind of go a little bit back to a couple of things, both the identification of the problem and ensuring that you're kind of setting what is that goal that we want to achieve, and then being able to measure against that goal. But this can also help in terms of getting that buy-in from senior management. So if you are able to put projects in place, being able to identify what's the value that we actually created out of this particular project, and how does this potentially help the organization as a whole. So being able to connect that back and you being able to properly articulate what is the outcome is fairly important in terms of being able to do this as well. So just sort of a quick summary of some of those challenges. A lot of them you really kind of drive from more of that strategic side of it. So thinking about, driving towards what that business purpose is for the activities that you want to undertake, ensuring that you've thought through from a strategic point of view, what are the governance issues or what are the ethical issues that we need to concern ourselves with. And then as well, just sort of improving the overall literacy around data within an organization. So, the next question that we asked is, so how do we help organizations start to address these challenges? Where we originally started was building this sort of foundational pieces that organizations need to consider as part of their overall data efforts. And we really came up with 4 areas. And for us, we really view that building this data foundation is important. And I think I've alluded to it a little bit earlier in the presentation, but it's building that data foundation allows you to ensure that as you start to take on things like artificial intelligence or other more advanced technology projects that really leverage data, you improve the chances that you'll be successful. It's not to say that you can't go out and do artificial intelligence or machine learning projects now, but it just increases the risk that if you haven't set that foundation around data, you potentially run the risk of not necessarily getting the results. And especially if you're having trouble around getting buy-in from senior management in these projects, it may do more harm than good in terms of trying to get their additional buy-in. So I'll quickly kind of walk through each of these aspects. The first one is really about data culture. And this is, how do you as an organization empower your employees? And again, thinking right across the entire organization, how do you empower them to leverage data effectively and you bring that data influence decision-making into their part of the organization? And it's also thinking through what are the pervasiveness of the infrastructure and the processes in place, and ensuring that everybody is sort of moving towards that more data influenced approach to it. And a lot of this has to start within senior management. So thinking through what are the processes that we're putting in place and how are we ensuring that we're sort of walking the talk of showing that data is really a valuable asset that we need to take advantage of as an organization. The next piece of it is aligning to business strategy. And this is what I've sort of alluded to in starting and centering any of your projects around a problem to solve or an opportunity to take advantage of. In conversations that we have with organizations, we often hear, we have a lot of data, what should we do with it? And from our standpoint, it's really reversing that around of what are the business challenges that we have as an organization, and how can we use data as an asset to help us in terms of solving for those particular challenges. And this just helps ensure that you're kind of driving that value for the organization, and that again, it's all kind of going back to some sort of return on investment from those projects that you're putting in place. Data projects can be very resource intensive and can cost the organization a fair bit. So you want to ensure that you're kind of putting the right pieces in place to ensure that you're driving that value at the end. The development process piece, there's a couple of components to this. So it's thinking through, do we have the skills and tools in place to help us in terms of doing the things with data that we need to do? So if it's, we need some sort of a dashboard to create, charts and visualizations of this data that will help our customer service representatives best understand the issues that customers see with their product. Do we have the tools and the skills that can help us in terms of creating those dashboards? In addition, it's also thinking through the communication process between your data and your development team and the business units, and ensuring that they're sharing information effectively across these two teams. So from a business unit standpoint, they're sharing, here's the customer challenges that we're seeing and the things that we need to try and address. And from a data team perspective, bringing that level of expertise back to the business units to say, here's the things that we can do with data that can help you in terms of solving these particular challenges. And then the last piece is really about the governance and ethics. And this is really, taking into account privacy, the regulatory aspects of it, and then also the ethical piece of it. And that's becoming increasingly important for organizations to really develop that trust with their consumers. And one thing to note from a privacy regulation standpoint is that all organizations need to consider this. Privacy regulations are not just for those large corporate entities that are generating huge volumes of data. It also applies to smaller startup companies as well. To give you an example, under GDPR, which has some of the strongest privacy regulations in the world, a company that was, I think, based in Spain that had less than 50 employees would actually fined $10,000 because they improperly implemented a checkbox on one of their collection forms for customer information. And by implementing this checkbox incorrectly, it was automatically signing people up for promotional emails. So, it's a very simple thing and a very small thing, but it ended up costing this company $10,000. So these are the things that you certainly want to think through and ensure that you are fully aware of as you're starting to go down the data innovation path. So we kind of started from this spot, and where we wanted to go is we wanted to create some sort of a tool that helps organizations start to break these 4 foundational pieces down into even more granular aspects. So what we did is, many people are probably familiar with the business model canvas. So what we did is we actually kind of engineered that and created a data innovation canvas. So, very similar. It's sort of this one-page tool that companies can use as a mechanism to help them in terms of understanding what are the key components that we need to think through that can help us in terms of addressing a specific problem or opportunity that we want to take advantage of. So, again, really centered around the problem, and it sits in the middle of the canvas. And the value proposition is really, the solution that you might be looking to put in place, or the opportunity you're taking advantage of. What's that outcome that you want? The pieces to the left-hand side are more internal-facing aspects of it. So things like organizational change, what potential aspects is the organization going to be facing that may impede us or inhibit us from actually putting this project in place. And it's thinking through these. And often these may not necessarily be simple things to solve, but by proactively thinking through it, you're at least aware before you start down the road of investing in this project where the particular roadblocks are going to be. And that's a big part of what this tool is intended to do. So, from an organizational change piece, it's sort of thinking through where are those potential roadblocks going to stand, and what things do we need to put in place to potentially either move those roadblocks or address those. The data sources piece is really thinking through what data do we have currently available to us that will help us in terms of solving for this particular problem. And it's interesting because a lot of organizations have not necessarily taken the steps that they need to help them in terms of understanding the data that they have available. So it's kind of akin to going to fix the engine in your car and not knowing the tools that you have in your toolbox that will help you in terms of achieving that outcome. So by thinking through this aspect, it'll help you understand here's the data assets that we have available that we can potentially leverage. In addition, it also helps you understand the data assets that you don't have available that maybe you need that will help you in terms of solving the problem. The activities piece is really what pieces do we need to do to this data to help us in terms of achieving the outcome that we want. So it could be, well, we know we have this data set that will be really advantageous, but there's some quality issues for it. So how do we address these quality issues to improve it? And then the skills and tools, again, is just, what skills do we need to help us in terms of achieving this outcome, and what tools or platforms do we need for these people to be able to do the things that they need to do with this information. On the right-hand side of it, these are more external facing. So customer segments is very much just like what's in the business model canvas. So it's thinking through who are the customer stakeholders and what are their particular challenges. The data channels piece is thinking about the flows of information within outside of the organization. It could be partially internally within the organization, but from an external standpoint, this is an important aspect to consider. If you are pulling data in from an outside source, what happens if something changes with the rights around accessing that information? Maybe that source disappears, or maybe the owner of that data decides that they're now going to start charging 20 times the amount to be able to access that. How does that impact your potential solution? So again, thinking through some of these things can be helpful to at least flag them as part of the solution that you're developing. And it may not necessarily deter you from moving forward, but at least you're aware that this is a potential risk that could arise down the road. And then the last piece of this is the governance piece, which I have sort of talked about a fair bit already, thinking through those regulatory and ethical aspects and security aspects. And then along the bottom, it's thinking through what are the costs that are associated with implementing the solution. So as an example, if we recognize that we need some data science expertise to help us in terms of putting this solution that we don't currently have, do we need to go hire that person or hire a person on contract to help us in terms of addressing that? And then the business value is, what's the revenue that we're going to generate? What's the cost savings we're going to create? It's just thinking through that return on investment. So, as I said, this is kind of the canvas that we've created. And what I want to do is just sort of quickly take you through an example. So I'm going to use the story of Moneyball, which many of you may have already be familiar with. Just quickly for those that aren't, back in the early 2000s, the general manager of the Oakland Athletics, Billy Beane, was facing a bit of a dilemma. He had a number of his star players that were all going to be hitting free agency. And because the Oakland Athletics were a small market team and had a budget that was about a third of what the top teams' budgets were, he wasn't going to be able to pay the market rates that these players were going to be able to get. So he decided to take a different approach in terms of building his team and use data as a mechanism to help him in terms of finding those players that were maybe undervalued, that the Athletics could afford more readily, but would still provide a competitive team. So I'll walk through the story of Moneyball to kind of give you an idea of how the canvas potentially would be filled out to sort of illustrate this particular story. So if we start with the problem, which is where you always want to start with when it comes to filling in the canvas, as I alluded to, Athletics were a small market team. They still needed to compete in this league, but they had a third of the budget of what other teams had available to them. There is a potential solution of identifying positional players that have a higher propensity to get on base. And these players may potentially may not necessarily be looking for the same level of salary that a lot of these other players that were being evaluated under different metrics that they would get, and it would be more affordable for the Athletics. There is a number of different customer segments, although it all sort of funneled into a similar sort of need. Fans obviously want to root for a team that's going to be competitive, and they don't necessarily want to go out and watch a team that's going to lose 75% of their games. Players also want to play for a team that's going to win. While certainly the salary is great, it's always much better when you're going to a ballpark knowing that you have a good chance of winning a game on any given day. And then lastly, from an ownership perspective, they want a winning team because the more that the team wins, the more it's going to drive gate revenue and improve the chances that they're going to turn a profit from their investment in the team. From an organizational culture perspective, in the early 2000s, baseball was still really steeped in this sort of scouting gut feel. So there was, certainly if you've sort of seen the movie or read the book, they use this phrase, he looks like a ball player. And that was very much the mindset of the league at the time. Yes, there was a lot of statistics, and there have been a lot of statistics in baseball for a number of years, but it had only been really used at a rudimentary level. And it was still that, scouts going out to individual games and going to see these players that was really sort of driving that talent acquisition. But within the athletics, they had a leader that was ready to push for change and really ready to take the steps that he needed to in order to see this through. From a data sources perspective, a lot of the statistical data is provided from the head office, and then the team itself would probably have some proprietary scouting data that was available that was unique to them. In terms of the activities, they needed to conduct some analysis on some of these statistical metrics to begin to correlate that to how it impacted wins for the team. And in order to do that, they needed somebody with the skills and tools to do that. And they had hired a Harvard economics major that was able to conduct this kind of analysis and was comfortable doing this type of activity. In terms of external channels, all of these things were flowing directly from the league office, and there weren't really any issues there. And from a governance perspective, there's no real immediate issues that had arisen from a governance standpoint, at least at that time. Interestingly, though, as baseball has evolved in terms of their use of data, governance has become a bit of an issue for the league, where we're now at a point where sensors could be put on players to collect even more data. But there's sort of this debate going on within the league about, is there an integrity issue on the game if we start going to that extent? So it's interesting how some of these things can change over time, and it's always good to kind of continuously rethink them. In terms of the cost, there was an additional cost of having a person on staff that was more analytically driven. And this is something that not a lot of teams had, probably not any teams had in the early 2000s. So it's something that would be a little bit unique to the athletics. But the business value was really creating a competitive team that would be able to draw more fans to the games, that would increase the gate revenue, it would increase merchandise sales, and ensure that the team was more successful from a financial point of view. So we've really developed this tool as a sort of a strategic approach to data innovation, and really as an opportunity to align this with a lot of the technical aspects in terms of leveraging data within organizations. The tool itself is intended to be used by any size of organization, from sort of the startup stage right through to enterprise level, and also from a public sector perspective too. There may be some minor adjustments from sort of a wording or an adaptation that may be needed, but you really tried to create it in such a way that it was very approachable for a number of different organizations and useful for them to start to think through from a business standpoint how they wanted to focus on leveraging data within their organization. And there's a few different ways that you can look to use it. So it could be an assessment tool to help the company itself understand what are the potential roadblocks that we have that we need to address that can help us in terms of moving our data journey forward. So these things, especially around that organizational culture piece, is an aspect that there may be some larger issues that need to be addressed to help in terms of pushing that forward. But it can be used from a problem-solving standpoint as well. I think this is really where it can really shine in terms of, we know we have a potential solution that we need to put in place. What are the things that we need to think about in terms of actually putting that solution in place? And we actually use this tool for the AVEN project, the HD mapping project that our team is undertaking right now as well, to help understand the challenges around putting a governance structure for this open HD map that's being developed. So we use the canvas as a mechanism to think through, what are the sources of data, what are the channels, to start to come up with the aspects that we needed to understand to help us in terms of putting a proper governance structure in place. And then lastly, it can be used as sort of an ideation starting point. So again, thinking through some of the data sources that you have available, thinking through who the customer segments are. And we actually recently ran a pilot session with another company to help them in terms of ideate around some ways that they can leverage data to improve the value that they're able to deliver to their clients. So in terms of how we help, so we're actually currently making the canvas available. The QR code up on the screen will take you directly to the form where you can sort of fill that form in and download a copy of the canvas. And you can also find it through our data-driven innovation page on the Communitech site. So the very long link at the bottom will kind of get you there. We've developed a workshop around the data innovation canvas that we make available as part of our corporate innovation programming. And in addition, we also use this as a tool in the data innovation workshop that we've developed that's kind of a bit of an earlier stage version that helps companies begin to ideate around how they can potentially leverage data to solve challenges within their organization. So we're starting to integrate this as in a lot of those programs. In addition, we have coaching available. So, in particular for our start and scale companies that might be looking to use this as a tool, I'm certainly available from a growth coaching standpoint to help them and provide some guidance and you working through the canvas and helping address some of the issues that potentially may arise by going through this. And in addition, for anybody that is downloading the canvas and wants to start working through it on their own, sort of the limited time offer, if you will, I'm happy to do sort of a 30-minute follow-up session to sort of talk through some of the challenges and issues that you may have that may have arisen through starting through the Canvas exercise, and can help you in terms of addressing some of those challenges and pointing you potentially in directions of how you could continue to sort of work through some of those potential issues. So there's a number of ways that we're starting to bring this into our own organization. So leave my contact information up here. We'll move on to questions, and I recognize I've only got a couple of minutes left in my presentation, but we will sort of address a couple of questions here. And so we've got one question here from Sanjay. It says, from your experience and especially with achieving quick wins in mind, how long is a typical data innovation project and time frame? So I think it really sort of the cop-out answer of it depends. It really depends on what it is that you're trying to undertake. I think if you're looking for something that's a small win, you want to ensure that it's something that you can kind of turn around in a relatively short period of time. You don't want to be necessarily putting a project in place that's going to take you months and months. You probably want to start, if you're thinking of it from a small project, something that's you're going to be able to do over a short period of time, over a matter of weeks maybe, in terms of implementing that particular process or system, and begin to get that learning quickly. So it's almost taking that lean startup methodology and applying that to applying these sorts of projects. So how do you sort of build something, put it in place, begin to learn, and then continue to adapt that project as you continue to learn more and more from it. So one question here within the Canvas, where would you address security? So that would really be addressed from our standpoint. We're really looking at that from a data governance perspective. So that is something that you would sort of fall within that element of it, thinking through not only the regulatory standpoint, but security sort of from our standpoint, falls within that piece of it as well. So thinking about what are the security mechanisms that you need to put in place, whether that is ensuring that data is encrypted, especially personally identifiable data is encrypted from end to end, in terms of any transmission that may be happening or communication of that data that may be happening. But really that's where we kind of see that falling within the Canvas itself. So, and I think we're at time, are we not, Vlad?
We are right on time. Well, Chris, thank you once more for offering your time and effort to present at the Data Hub sessions today, and for sharing your insights on the data innovation landscape and unveiling the data innovation canvas there.
Thank you. And
to everyone who joined us online, thank you all very much for attending another Data Hub session. We'll be sharing the slides with you this evening, along with a survey. I'd like to thank you in advance for taking the 2 minutes and sharing your feedback on today's session.